If you go back to 1955, 1956, 1957, at the World Health Organization, they explicitly decided that population control and population management was a specific objective of the World Health Organization. Now, you have to go back and ask yourself, when the World Health Organization was set up, who were the funding interests that were at the table? And it was the Rockefeller Foundation. It was the eugenics lab at Cold Spring Harbor Lab. And you heard me say that correctly, the one that Andrew Carnegie set up in 1913. These are the people who actually decided that there are too many people in the world.
And they decided it back then.
And the way to solve the problem of too many people is to come up with an immunization program. And not surprisingly, if you go to the 2011 document released by the World Health Organization, which is called the Decade of the Vaccines, and if you don't read these things, you'll never know. Yeah. But in that publication, The Decade of the Vaccines, they explicitly say the objective of why they're doing this is to make sure that they manage population numbers. So this is not I wonder what's happening. And this is not about public health. This is not about making sure that we don't have malaria, we don't have typhoid, we don't have cholera, we don't have things that are the diseases that kill us. This is about making sure that we have a population that is capable of being exterminated if somebody decides there's too many of us.
And you're not just talking about the COVID vaccine here.
Oh, no. If you go back and you look at the history of it, you look at the fact that we have tons of things that we now call, antibody-resistant pathogens. So MRSA, C. diff, all kinds of things, which are these nasty bugs where if you're at the NHS in the UK or you're anywhere in the health systems in the United States, you hear about these superbugs that evade the detection of all kinds of natural, either therapeutics or biologics or anything else. If you go back and look at them and say, well, how did those things come into being? The fact of the matter is they were created. If you go to the current U.S. government documents, you find that there are 64 registered toxins and pathogens that are currently in development, just like SARS coronavirus.
The biolabs that Fauci had to move out of America and Ukraine.
That's a lovely story, but he didn't move them out of America. He actually made the illusion of moving them out of America. But for example, this whole question, Peter Daszak, EcoHealth Alliance, did he really move that $3.7 million grant to Wuhan Institute of Virology? And the answer is no, because in October of 2014, 3 days after the gain-of-function moratorium was put in place by the federal government, by the Obama administration, a letter was sent to the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, which specifically stated that Ralph Barrick's gain-of-function research on coronavirus was not only subject to the gain-of-function moratorium, but at the last paragraph on that page, it says, but since your project is already funded, you can keep going. See, the public media has said, oh, we moved it offshore. We put it over in Wuhan. No, we didn't. We actually created the illusion of it. And while $3.7 million of research dollars went to Wuhan in 2014.
How much was spent in America?
$14 million on a continuously rolling schedule went to UNC Chapel Hill. During the gain-of-function moratorium, not a single person in the primary or alternative media has ever reported on this fact. Senator Rand Paul, who famously had Anthony Fauci in the Senate and had him opposite him in the Senate, had a copy of this letter in his possession, and at no point in any of the interactions he had with Anthony Fauci, when Anthony Fauci said, we never funded gain-of-function research, that letter is a public document. It was in his hands at the time of his questioning of Anthony Fauci, and to this day, not a single public servant, not a single member of Congress, not a single lawyer, not a single litigant, not anyone anywhere, and nobody in the mainstream, and no one even in alternative media has been willing to put that letter in the public, which I'm doing on my speaking tour of Europe, which is to make sure that apparently, since people can't find it and read it, despite the fact that it is a public document, I'm now making more public by showing that, in fact, they said that project was gain of function. The project that they reference is Ralph Barrick's project, and let me just see if this lands for you, which grew out of his 2005 presentation at the U.S. DARPA and MITRE conference that was entitled Biohacking, Synthetic Coronaviruses as a Biological Weapons Enabling Technology. Now, if you heard that, let's just say from anybody, somebody on BBC or Fox News or anything else, if you heard that the guy who brought you SARS-CoV-2 was paid by a grant that was funded off of a project entitled Synthetic Coronaviruses, Biowarfare Enabling Technology. Does that sound like public health to you? Does that sound like something that we want to save Granny from that one? No. But here's the problem. Just like we don't call it gene therapy, which we should call it, just like we don't call it genetic modification, which we should call it, just like we don't call it biological weapons, like we should call it, just like all of those things, we still are having debates about whether it's a good or a bad vaccine. It is a biological weapon created at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, unambiguously stated as such. Not my words, their words. And where do you find this cunning, devious data that's hidden so far into the ground that nobody can find it? You find it on Ralph Barrick's curriculum vitae on his public website at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. That's how difficult it is to find this. You can source it by, I don't know, looking up his CV. So anybody who even pretends to say that there's a question about where this came from or what it was intended to do is disingenuous. The fact of the matter is this was a weapons program, and it was designed to be disseminated, and in 2019, September 18th, 2019, the World Health Organization's Global Preparedness Monitoring Board stated, and I'm actually taking this right out of, I think it's page 8 of the document, in September 18th, 2019, we are going to prepare the world for an accidental or intentional release of a respiratory pathogen so that by September 20th, or by September 2020, the world demands a global vaccine. This is 3 months before allegedly patient 1 in Wuhan.
A leak, a so-called leak.
But it's not even a leak. They say accidental or intentional release.
Yeah.
They intended to actually release it.
This.
And when people sit there going, well, but how did it go, mysteriously from China to a cruise ship to northern Italy to Seattle to New York? How did it pop up? I point them to, a news source that I know is totally untrustworthy, the New York Times or the Washington Post, who actually did a study when the government was forced to do so, when it, under FOIA, had to release, that actually tested aerosolized pathogens in New York subway systems and in Washington civil systems and all kinds of other things. So this mystery of how did it happen is actually answered by the Defense Department's own documents that actually say that they, in fact, have already done this thing. So the giant mystery of how could it mysteriously show up? And how could the same variant seemingly show up all over the world despite the fact that we don't have planes that are actually carrying people exactly from these points? How did it mysteriously just proliferate around the world? How did it pop up here, pop up here? And why is it that when we went on to news stations, we always had the same number of COVID cases first? Try to find a news agency anywhere on the planet that didn't start with 3 cases. Is that how pandemics work?
So how
regardless of population? Regardless of population, you just happen to have 3, and then you happen to have 5, and then you happen to have 7. And we started building the fear porn about how many cases there were, except for the fact that all the news stations seemingly had the same number. That sounds like a script. It doesn't sound like a pandemic. And the reason it sounds like a script is because it is a script. This was not a how did it mysteriously jump out of a Wuhan bat market when a bat and a pangolin got into it one night and got a little drunk and, had their business, and then lo and behold, SARS. That's not what happened. This was a release of a respiratory pathogen. Why do I make that allegation? Because they wrote it on September 18th, 2019, and the world closed its eyes.